Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a psychotherapist in Dublin, Ireland, and this is my channel. So today I wanted to talk about the self, our kind of basic assumptions around what a self is, and even kind of what reality is and how it works. And what sparked off my recent kind of um, inquiry around this was learning about um, how our brains are kind of wired and um, programmed during infancy. And so a lot of us are familiar now with kind of this idea of neuroplasticity, that the brain is plastic. And so it responds and can change throughout our lifetime. So, through experience and through different practices and learning, certain neural circuits fire and then they wire together and create pathways in the brain. We used to think that, the brain developed into adolescence or adulthood and then it stopped and that's how it was. So it's a relatively new discovery that actually it's plastic the whole way through. But we also know that it's most plastic earliest on in life. Um, but not only is it most plastic earliest on, we're really born with like really plastic, malleable brains primed for programming. And there's parts of our brain that actually won't develop without social interaction and social input. And it's kind of thought that this is because we're such social creatures that actually it's really adaptive for us to be able to um, kind of develop within our context. So basically, culture and kind of social um, norms and ways of being in relationship and being together as community are so vital for us as human beings that a large part of our development neurologically is kind of learning all of that. And that actually gets hardwired into our brain um, so that we understand the world or kind of can function in the world because our world is so social. And I'm really interested in this based on our assumptions around how the world works, because it it feels like most of us or a lot of us are kind of functioning from this point of view that is actually underpinned by like the physics understanding of reality, which now is getting disproven in the realms of science. But I'm wondering if it's because it's actually so hardwired into our brain that even though the research is showing something different, we still essentially live in this reality that's underpinned by the philosophy of like classic physics from, however many kind of decades ago. Um, and what I mean by this is we're kind of all living based on the assumptions that we live in a mechanistic, materialist world. So we live in a world where it's full of separate entities. So I'm here, this separate individual self, and there's all of this empty space between me and this computer, and there's nothing in that empty space. And I am physically and psychologically separate from other people in this house right now or in the world. Um, and this kind of idea of like a universe full of separate objects. And even though we all kind of learn things, whether just personally or actually academically or through science, that discredit this, and even physics has gone so far as to understand things differently now. It's kind of like this is still our sense of things. This is still the basic assumptions that we're functioning from. And when you hear anything that assumes a different set of basic principles to reality, it seems a little bit wild and it can seem a bit airy fairy because this is so kind of common sense, even though we now know it's not true. And it wouldn't have always been common sense, obviously. But we kind of, there's almost this like superiority that comes with it as well, that it's so scientific and so objective and concrete that anybody who thinks anything different is really stupid. Even though now with quantum physics, it's like we know that that can't be true because we've been able to go further down and kind of measure things more precisely as we have developed beyond that, and realize that actually at its most basic level, nothing is a separate object. There is molecules, but there's also waves. And it's really confusing actually, because it's not just that there is molecules or there just is waves that are all connected, but it's like it's both. And so actually from a quantum perspective, I'm not this fixed object self here. I have like a fixity to me, and at a most basic level there are certain kind of fixed molecules that make me up, but at the same time I'm actually this field of molecules and energies that is kind of organized or pulled together as a self, but it's not fixed, it's actually in flux and happening moment to moment as this kind of more slightly more kind of ethereal, I almost want to say like lighter, like it's not so dense and static. It's actually, there's more movement and process and space in it. And the other thing that we know now from quantum physics is that empty space is not just empty, devoid of anything, that actually there is matter, but there's also kind of energy, and there's like the what we see as reality and the physical world, but then there's also this field of potentiality that all of the things that we see as physical reality, like this computer in front of me or my earrings, they all actually are coming up from this more subtle field of physical reality, of this potential. And I think this is really interesting for lots of reasons, um, and even just in and of itself. But if we think about it as informing how we understand ourselves, like what am I as a self? And we tend to identify or understand the self as like, I'm this person, I'm Sarah Skinner, and I live in this body, and that's who I am. And there's almost this kind of like, it's like fixed, it's an image, it has limited boundaries. And yet, you know, through psychotherapy and even kind of meditation and any kind of self-inquiry, we can start to feel that I'm not just this kind of 2D object of a self. Actually, what it feels like, at least as best as I could understand it, if at its most essential level, is I'm kind of this space and this point of awareness that organizes experience and emotions and concepts and ideas into me and not me. And this makes a lot more sense in relation to quantum physics than it does to that kind of materialist, mechanistic way of looking at things. And I've only come to know myself in this way through a lot of kind of personal experience and years of training and different practices. But I think it's really interesting that I would have started out from this quite limited, almost like superficial, two-dimensional understanding of myself, because this kind of feels like it relates to this idea of like, well, what is the universe? What are things? They're just these fixed objects and they just are the way they are and that's it. Whereas the reality is, and even now the science reflects that reality isn't just fixed the way it is, matter of fact. Reality is actually like this um incredible moment to moment creative process that we're involved in, that's ever emergent, and that um is not kind of objectified or limited or static at its most basic level at all. It's actually much more subtle than that. And it's so kind of like science is actually really starting to line up a lot more with like ancient mystery schools and understanding, even philosophies like Buddhism and yoga, and I'm sure loads others that I just can't think of right now. Um, which is a very different worldview and leads itself to a very different way of functioning in the world. And even though the science is lining up with it now, it's like that all, to a lot of people, if you say that, you're going to get this like cynical, skeptical kind of airy fairy judgment to it. Um, yeah. So, and the other part of this that is really important is consciousness. So, from the materialist mechanistic point of view, consciousness comes after matter. And I mean, even still, none of us can really explain consciousness or where it comes from. It's like that hard problem of consciousness that we can't actually get behind it. So it's very hard to explain scientifically. But if we're in that classic physics mode of looking at things, it's after the fact. So it kind of doesn't influence or impact physical reality, which is really objective. There's an objective, measured, quantifiable way of knowing things. Whereas actually with quantum physics, we know that consciousness does specifically and definitely influence physical reality. It has a very real impact. And even, looking at neuroscience, um, the more we're able to measure the brain, we can recognize there still seems to be like, to a large extent, this dominant school of thought that sees, okay, the brain is the way it is, and consciousness comes from the brain. So still consciousness is kind of secondary to matter. There is the physical world of biology, of my body and my brain, and then consciousness comes from that. And there are all sorts of different arguments about how exactly that works. But now we're starting to see that while it's true, a lot of the time in experiments, if you say hold certain images in front of someone, and maybe they're sad or they're exciting or they're whatever they are, they will cause certain neural centers to fire and certain things to happen in the brain as we would expect. So there is this correlation. But actually, if you hold up the same images or do the same experiment, but you ask the subjects to intentionally have a different reaction, different areas of the brain will fire. So that starts to break this down, then that consciousness just kind of happens as a side effect from the brain. And we can prove that because we can show where in the brain consciousness is happening in relation to something. Because actually, I, as a conscious being, can, by my choice and my will, actually influence matter and, create a different reaction in my brain. And there's this whole thing now of kind of actually being able to direct our neuroplasticity. So consciously aiming to have different responses to things. And so different neural um, architecture is kind of fired and created. And, this is a lot of the world of psychotherapy is kind of founded on this, that through process and through bringing our conscious awareness to things, we can actually change our responses to them and change our experiences of them. And, even just thinking about kind of like emotional self-regulation, that we can go from a place where we're maybe really struggling with emotions in different ways to actually having a very different relationship with emotions. And we can do this through our conscious ability and conscious effort and practice rather than, well, I'm just fact, this is just how I am, and the only way to get around it is maybe if I take a tablet, it might help. Um, And I suppose it's quite a, a privileged place to be as a therapist, that we get to experience this creative force of consciousness up close, both in ourselves and in our clients, and can really witness how meaning and reality is so created subjectively by us as subjective conscious beings, and that it's kind of like we can feel really trapped by things. And obviously there are limits to reality. Like, as much as I might want to be able to fly, I can't imagine in this lifetime I'm going to be able to develop my consciousness to make that happen, even if that's possible, sadly. But um at the same time, it's also quite incredible and quite magical to think how much we're limited by can actually change. So there's so much that we think is outside of our control and our power, but actually, with enough kind of intention and dedication and willingness to be open to experience and to ourselves and really do the work, that consciousness can really develop to a place that so much we maybe felt trapped by, we can actually change and have choice around. Um, yeah, and I think, this just feels really important for a lot of reasons, but particularly because it's it's very different in terms of how empowered we feel as people to influence our experience of realities, our own lives, and the world that we live in. And, starting from this kind of classic physics assumption of things, there's an inherent disempowerment because it's quite passive, like it's specifically passive. The reality is passive, it is the way it is. And we, as parts of that, are kind of objectified. Um, and so it, like, in this shift of understanding, first of all, we're not objects as individuals, and that in itself has huge ramifications for our experience. If we were to really know ourselves more as these subjective creative fields with huge depths in ourselves, huge power to influence our reality, and also inherent connection to the world around us and to everything, in such a spectrum of ways. And I think that has, like, innumerable consequences in terms of how we live our lives, that I probably couldn't even verbalize, all of them if I wanted to. But certainly, just from even that perspective, that understanding who I am and what is this life I'm living changes drastically with this more updated understanding of things, or like more ancient, because it feels like at one stage people understood some of this slightly better, and then as part of the evolution of science, we got really into being able to quantify and measure and prove things objectively. And of course that has its place, but in that kind of era of classic physics that we're still kind of starting from, even though the science is way beyond it, it's like, as our consciousness is still there, we still need to kind of collectively move past that. It's like that's the basic assumptions of the world that we're living in for a large part. And from that perspective, we're much more disempowered than is true. We're much more isolated and separated than is true. And even what I am as a self is radically different, because I'm not this 2D kind of static fixed image, that I do know myself as this body and this individual, Sarah Skinner, with her history. But the reality is in that, like, there's actually a huge dynamic process in every moment. Um, and if my knowing or understanding of what a self is has more depth and more of that space to it, that it's like, well, really, I'm kind of this point of consciousness and this field within which the process of Sarah Skinner is happening. It's kind of like there's a lot more flexibility for me as an individual in that. And there's also a lot more room for me to move. And so it becomes more comfortable then if I have a bad day or if I have a reaction that I'm not, you know, hugely thrilled by or I don't really know to be myself. It's less destabilizing because it's not like all of a sudden this really fixed idea of who I am as an individual is threatened by all of these crazy things that feel like outside of that. It's like I can understand, well, I'm still here. I still have this coherence as myself. And what's happening in this, part of my experience that feels really divergent, I can maybe approach that with more curiosity, like what's happening there? Because realistically, there's my conscious awareness, and then there's a lot that I'm unconscious of. And so I can kind of have a bit more curiosity about that, maybe recognizing that there are limits to my awareness of myself because what I am as a self is a lot more dynamic, complex, and vast than just this fixed entity of an individual. Um, yeah, so I wonder, does this make sense? And I'm sure there's people who know loads more about different parts of this than I do, and I'd be really curious to learn more. If anyone who's watching falls under that category, please do reach out and let me know.